let me just introduce myself briefly. So I'm Lohini Mudli. I'm with McKinsey. I work in the Johannesburg office, mainly focused on telecoms work and the internet. I did two pieces of work. Firstly, I was part of the consumer survey, particularly looking at the adoption of the internet. And after we did that work, we realized that it would be interesting to take it one step further and to look at how the internet was developing more broadly in Africa. And so we came up with the idea of doing Lions Go Digital. And really the reason for that was, I'm not sure if any of you have read Lions on the Move, but that was a report we published in 2010, which is really around what's happening with Africa's economies. And so after we did the consumer report, the consumer survey, we realized that actually adoption of technology and the internet was opening up the next chapter for the continent, which is why we decided to do the sequel called Lions Go Digital. And really this is all an assessment of, firstly, what's the state of the internet in Africa today, how different countries are progressing on this journey, and what's the potential going forward. Any idea how many Facebook users there are in Africa today? There are 1 billion people on the continent. Sorry?
You said 40 million.
Close. 52. How many internet users? Got to be more than Facebook.
150 million. What did the people say?
It's about it's about 16%, 160 million, 167 million. So, if you look at Africa today, not bad, right? 167 million people using the internet, 52 million people on Facebook. But that's really, not even 1 in every 5 people today. So it's about 16% of the population's on the internet. So if you look at it, we're really just at the start of the we're really just at the start of the journey. How do I work this? So here's some of the figures. And the other reason we say we're just at the start of the journey is you actually cannot really see any impact of the internet on the economy today. So right now, the internet, as we've calculated it, contributes some $18 billion to the GDP of Africa. So that's like just about 1% of the GDP. But we think it's going to change. And part of the reason we think it's going to change is what we see happening in cities. So when you look at it, Africa is not a continent of averages. Firstly, every country is different, and then within the country, there's huge variation. So when you look at what's been happening in urban areas, you see a very different picture, right? So 1 in 2 people are on the internet. 1 in 4 people are accessing the internet on a daily basis. So you see that there's this huge drive where the infrastructure is available, where people have some disposable income, they will get onto the internet. And really this is being driven by the fact that more and more people can get basic, relatively cheap mobile phones that have some kind of browsing capability. And the reasons people are on the internet, Facebook is the #1 reason. So most people are on the internet because they're either networking, checking email, reading the news, or downloading music. So it's basically about staying connected and entertainment. Very few people are shopping online. In fact, online transactions are fairly limited at the moment. And that's to do with other reasons like payments, logistics, etc., are all still challenges facing e-commerce users. So if you look at it from this perspective, you see that the cities are kind of gravitating towards this. They're embracing the internet. and you can see it tells a story of what will happen as infrastructure gets rolled out, and you have more people with disposable income. So we think it's going to be big, and potentially bigger than it is in some other regions, and I'll talk a little bit about why we think that is the case. But some of the reasons why we think it will be big is, one, urbanization will increase in Africa. So you'll have, by 2030, 50% of people will be living in urban areas. The middle class is growing. So you'll have more and more people with disposable income. Africa has one of the youngest populations. And the youth are natural adopters of technology. So these are all just if you look demographically, it stacks up that the internet will take off. Secondly, you see that there's lots of investment happening in Africa today in terms of infrastructure. Governments are prioritizing it. And I think more importantly, people are seeing this as a way, whereas in most developed countries, the internet is seen as an alternative convenience to other things that are available. What you see increasingly is that the amount of innovation that's happening is really about how do people address certain challenges. So things like remote diagnostics with regards to health. There's, for example, health presence in Senegal that uses video conferencing, video broadcasting to actually do diagnostics on patients, for example. So when you start thinking about what are the potential transformative impacts of the internet, you can see that it's going to be, that it could be relatively big. And then we made the point with mobile telephony. So if you look at where Africa is today, you see that if you think about us in terms of internet contribution, we're probably, we're half of what other emerging countries are. So by aspiring countries, we looked at countries like Turkey, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, etc. And, a third of where the average of developed countries, and that's not looking at developed countries like Sweden, etc., that are at 5% in terms of what their internet is contributing to GDP. When you look at mobile voice, however, you see that we are 3 times ahead of developed countries. And the reason for that is, whereas mobile voice was something incremental, it was a complete innovation on the continent, because for the first time people had access to communication. And so if you take the same logic forward and you think that the internet is going to have an impact beyond just giving people access to connecting with people and entertainment, there's potential to see that actually the potential impact for the internet in Africa could be as much as 10% of GDP, right? I mean, it's huge. It's not something that will just happen. It's going to take a lot of work to get there. But it's possible if you start thinking about how it could impact across various sectors. So if you look at education, for example, where, for example, there's a school in Kenya right now, or private school system, where people are trying to use technology to deliver cheap, affordable private schooling to students. So there's a group of schools called Bridge International that literally trains teachers with lessons every day on tablets. So the teacher has like a set system of lessons that they go through. This is all communicated to them. Plus, they're able to then manage the performance, report back their marks, and so on. And this is basically allowing them to, in this way, train a whole lot of teachers who've not had access to this before. Everybody talks about M-Pesa in terms of mobile financial services. And I think M-Pesa is like, only the start of it, but quite conceivably, mobile phones will be the banking channel on the continent. Not just in terms of making payments, but also with new applications, for example, mobile phones can act as POS devices. So they can be used to do credit and debit transactions as well, of credit cards and debit cards. If you look at agriculture, for example, you see, people have access to new information about crops, about when to plant. There's microinsurance products, for example, that rely on weather patterns. So they have base stations and weather stations paired up, so they can automatically pay out farmers if rain falls below a certain threshold in those areas. So in other words, farmers can buy this over the phone. They don't have to make a claim. They get paid automatically. So it's a very low-cost model of doing things. So when you start to think about those kinds of examples and they start adding up, you can see that there's potential for it to transform and address many of the challenges, long-standing challenges that have been on the continent. And I guess the question is, how do we get there, right? And to understand how we get there, it's also important to sort of think about where we are today. So we looked at 14 countries that make up about 90% of Africa's GDP today. So these 14 countries. Any guesses for which one is leading in terms of the contribution of the internet to their GDP? In dollar terms, it would be? South Africa. So in percentage terms? Kenya is second. Senegal. So we do this calculation called IGDP, which is basically a combination of private consumption, public expenditure, so how much that governments spend on the internet and internet-related systems, private investment, so how much companies are investing in telecoms infrastructure as well as digitization of systems, and then the trade balance. Now, Senegal comes out at 3.3%. So its overall contribution, internet contribution, is 3.3%. Kenya's at 2.9%. South Africa is 1.4%. Nigeria is at 0.8%. If you adjust Nigeria's GDP for oil revenues, so if you subtract oil revenues, then obviously it's higher. It comes to 1.5%. So the natural question there about, is there a way to use some of the revenues from oil, et cetera, to help diversify the economy and build the internet sector? So we looked at two factors. We looked at IGDP, which really says, how important is the internet to those countries today? And then we looked at a second thing, parameter, which we called the internet foundations, which says how robust are the foundations for future development of the internet. Now, interestingly, I think the Kenya story is widely known, right? Because a lot of people, when I said which country contributes the most, a lot of people said Kenya. Senegal has been a bit of a similar story, in the sense that both Senegal and Kenya have really been stories about the governments prioritizing the internet. And I think to some extent it shows, it's not to say that they will be the leaders 5 years from now, unless they address some of the other foundations. And certainly in the case of Senegal, it just outperforms all the other countries in terms of how the government prioritized ICT in that country. So it kind of tells a bit of a story in terms, if you think about lessons for the other countries, especially if you think about some of the poorer countries down here, which we call the emerging set of countries, that potentially with the same focus and the same coordination as you've seen in Senegal and Kenya, you could then accelerate the development of the internet sector in those countries. The other thing we looked at is, what was the composition of this iGDP? So we looked at the 4 different elements. And what you would notice is that, for example, even though South Africa was only 1.4%, it has a much more diversified portfolio in terms of its internet. So it's got a huge amount coming from its trade balance because of business process outsourcing. Morocco is the same. Whereas if you look at Senegal, for example, still largely dependent on private consumption. So unless it also develops some of its own export industries or increases the amount of private investment or public expenditure on the internet, there's a question about, how far will it go from where it is today, or has it kind of reached its peak already? And so if you look at the composition of their GDP today, you can already start to identify what are some of the opportunities for growth for them going forward.
Excuse me, what do you mean by trade balance?
So trade balance was the imports, the exports minus the imports. So in quite a few of the countries, obviously, negative because imports were higher. Only 3 countries actually where it was positive. So it was South Africa and Morocco because of their business process outsourcing industries. And then Kenya, mainly because it's selling on international bandwidth to some of its landlocked neighbors. Sorry, this is a terrible slide, but I didn't have time to make a decent one. But so you don't have to look at the numbers, but I think the point I wanted to make is when we looked at what the internet foundations were, we looked at 5 dimensions. So one is, what's the national ICT strategy? How coordinated is that strategy? Has the government got a prioritized plan for broadband? Do they know, for example, what's the kind of regulatory environment for encouraging investment, et cetera? Business environment, how easy, difficult is it to set up a business? How expensive is it? Infrastructure is kind of the state of play in terms of telecoms infrastructure, electrification, et cetera. Access to financial capital, so how easy is it for people to set up businesses? And then what's the ICT skills base? So how many IT professionals, engineers, et cetera, are there who can help to drive the sector? Now, just glancing down, the 2 weakest dimensions across all the countries, obviously, infrastructure is one of the big things. And when actually you look at the dollar per capita being spent on infrastructure today, either by the private sector or by government, it's around $3 per person on the continent. So well below what you see in other emerging markets and well below what you see in developed countries. And also when you look at the skills base. So these are the 2 things where across the board countries will have to focus on and develop strategies to address those 2 issues if you are going to see this big leap forward in terms of developing the internet on the continent. You see here, for example, if you look at the national strategy, you see Senegal basically led here. Basically because it was, for example, had no duties on phones and PCs to encourage people to buy them. Was one of the first countries to roll out a huge network of internet cafes, which encouraged people to use the internet. The internet is now being given by lots of companies as a fringe benefit, like medical aid and pension. So there are lots of things that were done to basically drive the use of the internet. So when we put them on these, we basically then said, okay, let's see what clusters we come up with. Obviously, this is how robust the foundations are. This is their performance today. Not surprisingly, Kenya and Senegal are the leaders. South Africa and Morocco are followers. They do much better than Kenya and Senegal in terms of having strong foundations. They're not leveraging that to deliver impact from the internet. So the question is, what's the room for them to grow? You've got this group here who is kind of floating. They don't have any particular strong point in terms of their internet foundations, but they're kind of emerging. And with most of them, private consumption is the thing that drives the internet. So the big question is, what can these countries learn from Kenya and Senegal to accelerate what they've done? And then for these countries here, except for Ethiopia, it's all the resource-rich countries. And the question for them is, how do they then prioritize and maybe divert some of their revenues towards developing the ICT sector and so diversifying? And so then we painted a bit of a scenario to say, okay, what could Africa 2025 look like? So we said, assuming 10% contribution to GDP, that means the internet could contribute up to about 300 billion. That would need about 50% internet penetration, which is not inconceivable, right? So if you're thinking about the internet being used for all these applications that I was talking about earlier, and infrastructure gets built out, et cetera, that's not difficult to believe. And then as smartphones become cheaper, there are a number of companies that are designing and manufacturing smartphones on the continent to bring down the prices. Tablets probably would leapfrog the PC on the continent, etc. This is one scenario for the future. So let me stop there and see if there are any questions, comments.
So if Nigeria and Angola on the last slide were punching below their weight, are these figures based off of assuming that those four buckets still exist?
No.
So Kenya, okay. So which country do you see sort of pushing this and really helping to make this happen, like this scenario, this 2025?
So, the countries that will make this happen will be the biggest countries, right? So it would have to be Nigeria, South Africa. South Africa should grow to 3-4 times its size anyway in terms of what the internet contribution. I think if you look at Angola, for example, it's just really, really way below, right? But even in these countries, there's very limited private investment today, very little government spending. And I think, if you start thinking about the internet being used to maybe deliver some elements of education. So, for example, e-readers being used instead of paper books. Using technology to help, to help stop counterfeit drugs, etc. It's conceivable that some spend that today goes to health and education could be used by governments towards enabling the internet, which would also then drive this IGDP higher. So in order to go to the next level, I think private consumption only gets you so far. And if you're only relying on private consumption, it's going to get you to not more than the 2%, whatever, that where some of the countries are today. So to take it to the next level, you have to have sort of concerted effort by government and a concerted effort by the private sector to drive some of the industry. So could some of the other countries, for example, develop their own BPO industries? Ghana wants to do it, Nigeria wants to do it, Kenya wants to do it. Kenya has set up, has got the likes of IBM, Microsoft, etc., that have set up headquarters there and are running research on the continent now. There are now of these software hubs that have been set up and that kind of development. But that's the kind of development you're going to need to get to that picture. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you mentioned like EPO, healthcare, education as like some of the key drivers, and those would be like government-led. But like private investment, are there specific industries that you see could really leverage this type of data and get to like that sweet spot as a percentage of like the IP?
Mm-hmm. So definitely financial services. And I think, not just mobile payments. I think, as service providers start offering mobile payments, they get credit history, they can start offering microcredit, microinsurance, savings products, so that's kind of ongoing. I think e-commerce is going to be big, so if you look at most of Africa, and you see that formal retail has not really developed, and you look at places like China where there was a similar case where you have a growing middle class, very limited formal development of retail. It's quite conceivable that a lot of people may go from shopping in markets to shopping online. The question is, how do you get them there? So a lot of the online retailers that have set up now have also set up kind of feet on the street forces, right? So they have people with tablets that go around to get people used to shopping online. And they give them multiple options for how they can shop online. So you can either send an SMS, you can also call it in, you've got pickup centers where you can pick things up, etc. But I think e-commerce will be big. Agriculture, I think, will be big as well from a private sector perspective. So if you see the number of commodity exchanges that are being set up to give farmers access to better prices, so that smallholder farmers can get access to bigger markets, etc. I think that's going to be big. I think the ones where government will really be involved are probably going to be health and education more than anything else. But in most of the other sectors, and then in general, there's this huge IT revolution that needs to happen in Africa. So if you look at the IT spend that companies have in Africa versus the rest of the world, it's tiny because most people are not spending on IT today. So as infrastructure gets better, as cloud computing develops, quite conceivably, that sector is going to grow significantly as well. I think that's why if you look at Kenya versus Senegal today, Kenya, I believe, is in a stronger position because it's got some government prioritization, but it's also got very good private sector collaboration, which is driving it. And I think you need both.
Feel free to the extremely bad decorum of coming in late and asking a question. I think it was interesting that you projected.
You're going to ask it anyway, so go ahead.
I thought it was interesting that you project that the number of internet users and internet access would exceed the number of smartphones. How is that happening, both, I guess, in terms of consumer technology and sort of access? Is this wireless access? Are you projecting better sort of fiber optic connectivity and hardline connectivity?
So you're saying because the number of internet users are more than the number of smartphones?
Yeah, usually twice as much.
Yeah. So I think, even if, so tablets, I think will play a big role. I think PCs will still play a role, but they can have, laptops can also use 3G connectivity. They don't have to have fixed line connectivity. Interestingly, I think as networks build out, so as 4G networks, for example, build out, operators are going to start putting more and more fiber into the ground because you have to for backhaul. And so there will be some emergence of a fixed line in Africa like we've not had before.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm more like kind of final question. The way you like classify the countries in Africa is seems homogeneous, but it feels like South Africa is really different from the rest. At McKinsey and through this study, to what extent do you feel this is true?
What, that South Africa is
That
different?
South Africa is like almost already like a developed country compared to the others.
I mean, if there are any other South Africans in the room, feel free to comment as well. So, I mean, I think that, South Africa is really two worlds, right? You can't call it a developed country or a developing country. It has two distinct worlds. What's interesting, though, is that even from a developed country perspective, so even if you look at the developed parts of South Africa, its internet adoption has been muted, partly because, and I think it's only in the last, I would say, 12 months, given the new offers that have come on from the mobile providers, because definitely the internet, I mean, I don't even make the point, but the internet in Africa will be mobile. The number of internet users in South Africa has grown. So there's something to be said about, even in a developed country, if you don't have the right infrastructure and you don't have the right offers at the right prices, that's going to mute demand.
Quite an esoteric question, I suppose. But so this is happening, and it will happen by 2025. And I suppose
Or it could happen by
it could
2025.
happen. When you look at history, and they always go, right now is Africa's time. Now the success is due. I mean, it's now going to really happen, right? I mean, there's not a lot that can go wrong if we can get this connected and get this.
Look, I mean, I think we've seen over the last few years, right, that Africa has sustained growth rates, very high growth rates. And it is to some extent the last frontier in a lot of ways, right? It's the last substantial place of big growth left, which is why China is there, which is why Korea is there, because that's kind of the last frontier of growth. Do we use it wisely? I guess is part of the question. And that, I mean, let's get back in 2025 and see whether this picture is realized or not.
Hi, I have a question. So it's interesting, this, mobile expansion both here and in Africa. For example, like here, mobile is really defining, the way we do everything. I work in internet, and everybody's scrambling to improve their mobile, like advertising. It's really big, like, shopping. And here you really see the connection, and you see the value, and you see that, we're not getting enough advertisers because, we're not very good. Like, our mobile product sucks. Like, let's spend more money on mobile. So I wanted to find out, like, how real is it, aside from, like, mobile payments and banking, which is huge, which everybody is now like mobile banking and payments in Africa. Like, how does it really translate in terms of these other things? Like, we're saying there's a lot of young people, on Facebook, social, and all that. Like, how does that translate for other things like advertisers or shopping? My feeling is that I talk to a lot of my friends, and it's like, okay, so we have Facebook and we have all this. But they don't have like credit cards and, to buy online. So how does that translate for other things like, shopping? How does it translate for advertising? And are we seeing all these different aspects work hand in hand? Like here we're seeing that, for example, magazines were huge. Like, People Magazine, everybody was buying it. But now a story comes out and it's already online, so nobody's buying magazines, so everybody's like, let's change our business to mobile. Like, how real is this in Africa? Like, is there adoption, and are people taking it seriously?
So I mean, I think in terms of e-commerce, there are definitely challenges with regards to payments and logistics. I think that's without a doubt. The question is, will e-commerce develop in Africa the way we know it in the developed world? I don't think so, right? So, for example, today, there's cash on delivery, right? You can Zando, one of the providers in South Africa, they wait, you can try it on, you can send it back, right? They have pickup spots where you can go and fetch things. But the point is that today, these retailers offer people more choice than they've ever had, right? So it's a question of, what is the right value proposition? And do they make it, right? And then there's also this question of, can mobile money be the interface between, to take over from payments? Because credit cards are, 1% in Africa? Yeah. So that's not going to be the idea. I was speaking to someone earlier who said, she's starting up this business with mobile payments that would be used as savings for people to then make purchases online. So I think the question is, how much innovation is there going to be? I was at an event recently with this group of entrepreneurs. And they were doing all sorts of amazing things. So the one woman had set up this supply chain project where she was using smartphones and feature phones to basically help traders in Mozambique buy their supplies versus them having to come across the border to buy them in South Africa and go back. So, the value proposition for them is they save 2 days in travel, they save their travel money, they can buy more stock, changes their lives. So the question is, what are the innovations that will change people's lives? And if it does, then it'll take off. Yeah.
Speaking of e-commerce and mobile payments, I was wondering what kind of infrastructure or how many years would it take for African countries to be able to develop digital currency such as like a Bitcoin that has been successful in?
So there's a lot of reasons. There are lots of different issues. And again, I think it comes down to value proposition. So if you look at Kenya and M-Pesa, right? M-Pesa was basically took off very quickly. I mean, and I can't remember the number, but there are millions of people on M-Pesa today. You can go to a market and pay a trader with your mobile phone. No problem. You can pay a taxi driver with your mobile phone. So it's replacing cash in a big way, right? But it is probably the most successful rollout of mobile money on the continent. For one, I think is that it was just very well executed by Safaricom. Secondly, it was it helped that they had 80% of the share. So basically, if you were on Safaricom, your friend was probably on Safaricom, and so you could use M-Pesa. Thirdly, it's served a very important function about people working in urban areas but being able to send money to their families in rural areas. And so that was something that was unique about it, and that's what started to increase the adoption. But the fourth thing as well is because it was led by Safaricom, which was a mobile operator and had a large network of airtime agents. Those agents also became the cash-in, cash-out network for M-Pesa. And so it was very convenient for people to do it. If you look at a country like Nigeria, for example, where mobile money is struggling to take off, one of the reasons is there is no extensive cash-in, cash-out network. So the convenience factor is not there. So there are a number of things that need to be in place before something. And then, of course, as it takes off, like with M-Pesa, then cash in, cash out doesn't become an issue anymore, but you need it in the beginning to bridge that gap.
So you mentioned that our GDP would be, by 2025,
10% of GDP.
Yes, I said it could be.
Could be.
I just want to emphasize again, it's not a forecast.
Okay,
It's a
could
scenario.
be.
Yeah.
And within that, you mentioned some barriers. For example, e-commerce could be a white space that could drive that with a barrier of logistics and payments. Do you foresee other barriers in reaching that number that businesses will need to overcome in order to maximize the value of what internet can bring?
So the other big barrier, I think, is capabilities. So, when we talked about, the ICT capabilities, I think, do we have enough engineers? Do we have enough IT professionals, etc., to support such an industry? I think that's going to be one big barrier. Even though we say 50% of urban Africans are using the internet today, they all complain about the quality of the infrastructure. Everybody says we want faster internet and we want cheaper internet. So infrastructure is going to be another barrier. And then, even though the internet is mobile, there's only so much you can do on a small screen device. So even though people in Africa are using their small screen device to do just about everything, it will be a limitation. And so that's why, bigger smartphones, tablets, etc., those kinds of things come in that will help to address that.
I'm going to ask 2 questions. So my background is in urban planning, civil that kind of stuff. So my first question is just jumping off some of the things you mentioned to do with innovations. Like in cities in the West, like big data and analytics is becoming like a thing. How do you see that translating into Africa, in the sense that how will governments sort of harness all this information that's being generated digitally, especially in urban areas, into sort of meaningful service delivery? Or sort of how can they innovate to do a lot more with less? And my second one is to do with sort of this sort of tech agenda that a lot of countries seem to be on the sort of propagating, in the sense that a knowledge economy, for instance, Silicon Savannah or Kansas City in Kenya, and how that sort of slant will translate into sort of meaningful growth, because it seems to sort of mimic a very Western American construct in an economy or region that is very, as you said, starved of engineers, tech people.
Yeah.
So, how will that work? Or will you see sort of an African articulation of a knowledge economy?
What's your view?
Sorry?
What's your view?
My view is, I think Google using network signals from phones in Nairobi to map out transport routes makes sense. I think that the idea that you can replicate Silicon Valley or Cambridge without a science park in the African desert or savannah is a stretch. So I think an African-led sort of approach to that, or one that is sort of ground up and organic, would make more sense. Of course, with government support and private sector support, but the idea of I don't know, sort of copying this model that seems to be all over the world is problematic, especially in terms of GDP and spending on things like healthcare and water and sanitation. That seems to might take more of a perspective, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a very interesting perspective. I think that, what was your first question?
My first was to do with big data and
how helpful that can be.
yes.
So, I think, so building on your first question, right? If the internet, if ICT can help to make governments more effective, right? Take the example of, Nigeria has just, not just, but over the last 12 months, whatever, launched this, what they call the government's integrated financial management system, right? Which allows, at a federal government level, to manage all the cash flows. That essentially has led to a massive saving for them, because now they know for the first time where all the money is, right? So if those kinds of investments then free up money to do other things, I would say why not, right? If, for example, you can use, e-readers to rather than paper books to reduce the cost of textbooks, again, why not? So I think there's a number of places where government spending could become more effective if they invested in infrastructure. I think, I think the Savannah part of Silicon Savannah is important. Because I think if Africa is going to develop a robust ICT sector, it will need to also innovate. And while there are a number of initiatives right now to build, cheaper laptops, tablets, etc., reality is we'll find it very difficult to compete against China in terms of low-cost manufacturing. But we can potentially innovate in the area of software because you have to develop software for localized needs, etc. And so if there's one place where we can innovate, I would say that would be it. Now, how that innovation happens and what form it takes, presumably it would be innovating for the needs of what Africa needs to address its challenges. But should Kansas City pretend to be a Silicon Valley? Probably not. It would,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
I just have a question regarding data and family. So I work in a software company where you're talking a lot. It's like you're a company like Microsoft, IBM, and SAP, big software companies, and they're looking to bring the software that carries more than e-commerce to African companies. So my question is, when these companies bring big software that we so from African banks, how does that affect the innovation of Africans to actually build their own, like their own software systems, and what do they take on the innovation part?
Yeah. So, I think at the end of the day, we are part of a global economy. And I think that it probably doesn't make sense to replicate things that are being done well and that you can use. And so that's why I think the innovation part is important, because if you're building software to particularly, deliver certain solutions, for example, managing schools or helping people test blood pressure. I'm just thinking of some of the examples I've heard about what people are doing to innovate at the moment. I think there's huge scope for that. So I think on the innovating to address specific problems that happen on the continent, I think is where the innovation will happen. Here.
What are the specific examples that you see as bellwethers kind of leading to the penetration of e-commerce and smartphones by 2025? Are there examples right now of startups or large companies that are making a lot of progress, or haven't they been invented yet?
So I think there are a few examples. I mean, has anyone heard of Rocket Internet?
Yeah.
So I think Rocket Internet is doing interesting things, right? And they're trying to innovate their business model. Have they got it right yet? No. So if you look at total e-commerce activity on the continent, it's still less than 1% of retail spend. But I'm not even sure if any of the players at the moment really would be part of that. And I'm not even sure they have the vision to say, we want to be the Pan-African Amazon, for example. So the question is, is there a player who's going to want to do that? Or potentially what's going to happen is when, Amazon runs out of other growth markets, Africa will be the next frontier.
Hi, so I guess to forecast a little bit through my biases, I'm a journalist and I spent a lot of time thinking about sort of information goods, the information economy, why it matters and how it's changing. So this is of great interest, obviously, because digital communication matters. And I wonder if you have a position on whether the sort of proliferation of connectivity will have sort of positive social and democratic benefits or whether perhaps, as you might think in the OECD or other countries where we have reached this kind of peak connectivity, it's become like sort of distracting for civic culture. I know this is not strictly, it's not an IGGP figure, but I'm just assuming you.
No, I think it's a great question.
Yeah.
I think it's a great question. I mean, I think absolutely, right? I think the one thing everybody says is that it's going to increase access to information. It will help people communicate, so it helps people organize. So I think from that perspective, you know, it helps highlight corruption more. So I think from those kinds of perspectives, yes, it'll have a very important role to play in making societies more transparent, fairer, etc. Yet at the same time, yes,
There's not many videos as well. Okay.
Yeah, soap operas and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I work for the AOL Huffington Post Media Group, and when the Arab Spring happened, we were not getting enough stories like quickly. So it was a really good opportunity for us to start like Huffington Post in Tunisia, like that area.
Yeah.
And it's really been like crazy in terms of the stories and people wanting to voice their opinions and write like really good stories. Like in the US now, it's all about content. Like, so, we are selling a lot against, the content that we're getting there.
Yes.
And it's also had, a social impact where people, put these stories directly online and, they're getting their governments to think about the issues.
Yeah. That's it. Anything else? Any other questions, last comments?
I'm just curious, in terms of stuff like that, the event industry, don't you think that with companies like Bring Up and Doctor, would that have a benefit on the trade balance?
Yes.
So what would what's your opinion on that?
Look, I mean, in fact, if you look at most developed countries today, they have a negative trade balance. It's actually only the emerging markets who have a positive trade balance on the internet, because so it may be that we import software, it may be that we import hardware, but we could, for example, export services, like business process outsourcing. Because at the end of the day, in a global economy, I think, whoever is most competitively advantaged to do something should do it, versus everybody doing it for themselves.
If you weren't at McKinsey right now, and let's say you had a little bit of professional freedom, where would you be spending your time? Where would you be innovating?
Where would I be spending my time?
Yeah, where would you put your bets? What would you do if you had to start a company based on what you know about these emerging trends? What would you do?
I think perfecting the e-commerce model would be something to do. Thinking about, what would be a truly scalable model. And probably trying to get it right in Nigeria first. Because I think if you can get it right there, the rest is going to be easy. I think the other really interesting opportunity, but probably maybe less exciting, is this idea of how do you create affordable private type schooling on the continent. So how do you scale up? How do you build low-cost private schooling and scale it up on the continent? I think that's going to be a big one. And then the third one for me is content, because I think there's a huge amount of content that's being developed that's not being fully aggregated at the moment and distributed. So, yeah.
So, we talked a lot about the great stuff that's happening in Africa and how everyone's moving there. My concern is that there might be a tech bubble that occurs. Because when you think about the people who are on the continent building apps, everybody's now app crazy because, apps are free to build, so I'll build one and I'll sell it. But no one's really thinking, at least from my experience, about the monetization strategy of an app, right? It's not, you're selling ads essentially on an app. There's nothing else that you can sell.
But you're right. That's it. So I guess that's it between you and the gala event and your coaching sessions. So thank you very much.